Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Eric Kaufman. Eric is a professor of politics at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He kind of focuses on cultural politics, ethnicity, national identity, and he's author of a book, White Shift, Population, Immigration, and the Future of the White Majority. And he's had a recent, research paper out about academic freedom in the Anglosphere. Hi, Eric. Thank you for coming on.
Great to be here, Bate. Thanks for having me.
So I guess we could start with your latest paper there. I don't know if you call it a paper or
It's a
research.
report, like a think tank
Uh,
report.
okay, and that was about academic freedom in Canada, United States, and the UK. Um, and I mean, a lot of this stuff has been coming out about how I think Jonathan Haidt has done it about how left the university was going, and I mean you kind of see it all the time. People getting professor University of California was almost fired because he said a Chinese word that sounded like a bad word and things like that. So, how did you start? Like, what was the impetus for you to do that? And what were some of the things you found?
Well, yeah, so I think this is all falling within a broader research agenda that is looking at the phenomenon of what I call left modernism, which is sort of the leading cultural ideology of our time. And that's not the same thing as socialism. It's not materialistic like socialism. It's much more about identity categories, which have then been fused with a socialistic worldview of oppressor versus oppressed. And so they've taken the categories from liberalism, which is religion, so religious minorities, sexual minorities, etc., gender, which were concerns of liberalism, and then they fuse those with a sort of oppressor-oppressed conflict-based mindset, which comes out of socialism. But actually, this new ideology is now actually adaptable to capitalism, so woke capitalism, or you can go the other direction and woke anarchism. So it's not socialism of the old school. So I'm interested in that ideology, which I think actually has a long history. And it emerges through the two world wars as a kind of dominant high cultural ideology. And then I'm interested in how that interacts with certain policy areas, one of which is around national identity, immigration, and so forth. And also the other is political polarization. And so within that context, I'm then interested in the spread of this ideology within institutions. One of, this, and the epicenter there is the university system. And so I was kind of interested in this phenomenon, which is well documented, which is the ideological tilt of the universities, particularly the faculties. And there have been successive academic attention paid to this over the years, not as much as you would expect there to be paid, I think, given the importance of this. But there has been some work that's been done, and it's shown a drift. Academia has not always been as left-wing as it is now. It's always had a preponderance of left-wingers, but it's not. And it's gone from something like 1.5 to 1. This is including the sciences and including all universities down to the lowest ranked colleges. It's gone from about 1.5 to 1 in around 1960, 1970 to around sort of 6 to 1 now. And if we take something like the most left-leaning disciplines like sociology and the softer social sciences and humanities, it might have gone from about 3 to 1 to 12 to 1, or up to 14 to 1 today. So that shift, I think, is interesting, and it also I'm interested in how that is reproduced, that tilt is reproduced. Is it just a matter of people selecting, opting in, self-selecting, and so you get a certain kind of person self-selecting in? The question then becomes, well, why is that happening? So what this report is, it's actually a very comprehensive thing, and it's basically 60,000 or 60,000 words. It's like a book, 200 pages almost, very detailed exploration of the UK, Canada, and the US based on eight surveys. So it's largely quantitative, evidence-driven. I'm trying to get away from the idea of the anecdote. We all know the anecdotes, and that's been important, but it's been done very extensively by people online, perhaps, Douglas Murray and Andrew Doyle and all kinds of people. We've got a lot of very powerful anecdotes about, Charles Murray and Brett Weinstein and all kinds of people, Germaine Greer and others, who've had difficulties with cancellation. Now, the issue then becomes, well, this is often brushed aside. People say, well, there's only a few no platformings a year. There are 100,000 academics in Britain. There's maybe 500,000 or a million in the US. This doesn't matter. This is a right-wing moral panic. So part of what I was trying to do here is to say, well, no, actually, we have a very solid evidence base that's kind of quantitative and survey-based that will show you, for example, that fewer than 1 in 10 Trump-supporting academics, fewer than 2 in 10 Brexit-supporting academics say they would be comfortable expressing that view to a colleague. Now, that's giving you a sense of how pervasive this chilling effect is. And it's really the chilling effect that I concentrate on the most as the greatest threat to academic freedom. Not a few no platformings, even though those are important and they're symptoms, but they're symptoms of a much bigger disease that lies under the surface.
Okay. Like you'd mentioned the chilling effect. Now, I mean, I see that a lot. Yeah, I'm gonna get it out of academia just for a second. It's just like in general day-to-day life. I got into looking at all of this stuff because of the conversation around Islam. It was basically I got called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam, and it was like, where the hell is this coming from? And I just wanted to know because it just seemed weird because one, I'm brown,
right?
So that's when I started looking into this. But I had friends who would say that, I'd post something about Islam on my Facebook and I had friends say, oh, I'm glad you're saying this because I can't say that. I'm like, why not? Well, I'm white. I'm like, that shouldn't matter,
Yeah.
So I started seeing about things like that. So, and like the chilling effect as well. Like, I mean, I'm going to stick with this. It's, the grooming gangs in the UK. And now this obviously, the grooming gangs predates what's going on in the university because I can go back, you can trace that back to the 80s. But, social workers and the police were afraid to go after South Asian men because they didn't want to seem racist. So,
right.
Like, were you looking at that as well? Like, were you looking at, the runoff effects from the academy of how it goes on to public, or were you just focusing on academics?
Well, I think the point you make is really an important one, which is that this is not just a post-2015 phenomenon. I mean, yes, there's been a big upsurge in cancellation campaigns, no platformings, and everything since 2015, as Haidt and Lukianoff say in The Coddling of the American Mind. But what I argue in the book and elsewhere is that actually this is part of a much older development. So, for example, the kind of minority sensitivity you talk about with regard to the grooming gangs, let's say that there's a dial and you've got sensitivity to minority sentiments or perceived minority sentiments at 0, let's say in 1940. And then you have a dial, right? And then it's up to 6 or 7 by 1969. And by 1989, it's up to 8 or 9. And then by 2015, it's at 11. I think that is a better way of thinking about this development. And so the question then is, well, this issue of minority sensitivity and the taboo around racism, that it's blasphemous to mount any kind of criticism of any kind of minority if you are white, let's say. Where does that come from and how does that develop is I think an interesting story. And I think it is the case that the ideological innovations were already there in the late 1960s for the most part. Not all of the innovations, trans wasn't yet there, but most of the stuff around race, gender, sexuality was already kind of there, even if it was a small number of people that were advancing it. So you can see, for example, in 1968, radical black students and their fellow travelers are occupying the offices of the University of San Francisco, and they demand 50 black studies positions and that every black student be admitted. And, you have Black Panthers going into university buildings with guns, and you've got all kinds of things happening in the late 60s, which are, I think, in many ways equally or even more outrageous than what we see now. And it's not as though that was just all of a sudden shut down. I mean, there was a lot of toleration for that, and there weren't many good answers for why they shouldn't be doing this. And you also had intellectuals like Nathan Glazer saying, these people call themselves the free speech movement, and now they're trying to silence speech of professors who they don't like. And that was already going on in the late 60s. And so once that mindset is there, it's just a question of scaling it up. It's of generations entering into institutions, becoming the professors, no longer the students, inculcating another generation, then going from the universities into corporations, into publishing in the media, and so on. So it's an ideology that is advancing through these elite institutions. So what I would say is that, yeah, there definitely is a connection, and it runs through that initially just a hypersensitivity to minorities, which then becomes a sacralization and holiness attached to minorities with a certain hierarchy. And then it becomes what John McWhorter would call the religion of anti-racism. So you have this kind of gradual sacralization taking place where criticism is blasphemy, and you have to, take the knee or bow the head or whatever you have to do. A very religious sensibility emerges. And that we're living through that now in the elite institutions. And it's having all kinds of kickbacks in terms of now it's colliding with real politics. And it's doing things like helping Donald Trump get elected, and it's doing things, so it's causing, polarization and anti-elitism, and all of these other things are coming in its wake. We're living through that politics.
Yeah, I might, because I'm reading a lot of this stuff lately, because like I said, I was just trying to figure out where some of this is coming from. So this might not have been in your report, but it was something like 25% of PhDs were okay with firing someone over wrong views. And I think it was something like 60%, so 25% of professors, and I think it was like 60% of PhDs or 50% of PhDs.
Right, yeah. So I had four survey questions where I sort of had hypothetical scenarios. So they were all about professors who found certain things in their research. So one was, kids do better with two parents than they do with one. These are not things that I'm endorsing, but they are loosely based on actual cases. Or another is, greater race and gender diversity leads an organization to do not as well. Or, so quite very controversial findings, no doubt about that. Not asking people to agree with these findings, but the question is, well, would you agree with essentially trying to get them out of their jobs at a university? So it's really about canceling. And I mean, there's some good news. You could say that on average, fewer than 1 in 10 academics were in favor of campaigns to get rid of these academics who are finding these results. But on the other hand, if you take anybody who answered at least yes to at least one of those four campaigns, it's 25% of current social science humanities academics who are saying yes to at least one of those four. Still a minority, still somewhat good news in the sense it's still a minority. But if we look at the academics under age 35, they're twice as likely to endorse these campaigns. And if you look at graduate students, PhDs, they're even more likely. So it's in the US, it's sort of above 50% were willing to endorse at least one of these four campaigns. So there's a significant group of pro-cancel academics coming down the pipe. It's a larger share. And this is why I'm arguing that the problem isn't going to fade away. It's going to get worse before it gets better, because the younger, and it's not about ideology, the younger people entering academia are no more left-wing. They're about the same. They're very left-wing, as are the current academics, as are the older academics. So that's not where the difference lies. But the young far leftist is a lot more intolerant than the older far leftist. And that's the problem that I see coming at us.
Just on that, so like, say 25% are in favor of, firing someone or having them removed from a position. Did you look at stats on hiring? Like, I know you mentioned that, like 1 in 10 Trump supporters didn't want to talk about their political views, but what about, because I saw something yesterday, I don't want to mention the account because they're they don't want to get in trouble, and they're in academia. And, they'd mentioned that they were on a hiring committee and they were looking to hire a new professor. And one of the people on the committee, she said, well, this book or this paper you wrote made me feel unsafe, and that person wasn't hired, even though they were qualified for the job. So have you looked at how this is affecting hiring? Because if they're willing to get rid of people, obviously they want to bring those people in so that they have to get rid of them later. So like, I'm just wondering if there's a correlation in there.
Yeah, hugely important. I mean, there's two kinds of what I would call progressive authoritarianism going on. I mean, one is the sort of hard form, like either disciplining or threatening with discipline or firing, for example. I mean, that is, if we get away from firing and we include other forms of discipline, like being demoted or taken off of kind of teaching or research that you want to do, or being threatened, that's 1 in 3 conservative academics or graduate students in America that have faced that threat. So that's the hard threat. But then we also got this, what I call soft authoritarianism, which is anything but soft, but say being discriminated against for your political views. And here we see that in the surveys, using a method called a concealed list experiment, shows that 1 in 3, 40% of American academics and 45% of Canadian academics would not hire a known Trump supporter for a job. And in the UK, it's 1 in 3 wouldn't hire a known Brexit supporter. And these are all positions that are either majority, slight majority, or slightly less than majority of the population fall into either the category of Brexit supporter or Trump supporter. So, or Trump voter. So yeah, this is pretty astounding, but it shows quite a high level of discrimination. Now, it's not because, it's important to note, this isn't because academics are worse. Actually, I mean, if you take someone with a degree who is on the left, who works anywhere in the world, in another institution, they will answer similar. They will be just as discriminatory. So we've kind of got this general problem of discrimination. But of course, when you have a more even mix of conservative and leftists, then they kind of, I won't say they cancel each other out, but it's not as much of a problem as when the ratios are 10 to 1, let's say, and then the 10, even if the 1 and the 10 discriminate against each other at the same rate, all the discriminatory effect more or less hits on the minority when it's in a 1 out of 10 position. And so that's kind of what's happening is you've got, it may be that in a hiring committee of 4, 3 of them might not be, or 2 of them might not be biased against the conservative. But if they're all on the left, 1 or 2 of them will be, and that is typically enough to sink the person's candidacy. Now, as a response, of course, conservatives will shy away from saying what they really think. They'll conceal their views. They might even pretend that they're a progressive. These are the coping strategies, and there are papers that show this. In the US, you can tell somebody's party registration. And so they basically asked people to try and identify from their published work who was a conservative and who was not. They couldn't, the coders, the people who they asked to identify, the conservatives couldn't pick out the conservatives because the conservatives were concealing their views, whereas they could pick out a lot of the liberals because they were much more open of their views because their views are the majority. So, and this is partly what I mean by the chilling effects. And what that does is it simply means certain questions aren't asked. Certain perspectives never see the light of day, and that's really the effect of this discrimination is to distort the entire body of knowledge and production of knowledge in academia.
Okay, but I went to university in the late 80s. Like I went to college and university from the late 80s to finish in 95. And there, it was starting around the time, it was around the time of the first, political correctness and all that stuff. So I saw some of that nonsense. But I mean, the whole point of the academy is to find the truth or an approximation thereof. But if you're so afraid of a viewpoint, that's what I don't get. When this stuff started becoming more and more ascendant, and I know you mentioned in the 60s and stuff, but I just started becoming more ascendant in the late 80s. Why weren't older academics pushing back, or were they just afraid? Or, I mean, was it just because of the siloing effect of the university? The English department won't criticize the physics department. The math department won't criticize sociology because, they've got their PhDs. They're the experts. We know math. You guys know sociology. What was it?
Well, here's the thing: is that I actually don't think that the side that was opposed to all this politicization of the academy ever really had developed arguments, were ever really willing to stand up. I mean, they might have been willing to say, well, we favor people who can do rigorous quantitative analysis, and we don't want to have mushy critical theory come into our department. They might have made those arguments, and strictly on methods grounds, but they weren't really willing to resist the narrative that says, I came into the academy because I wanted to be an activist. I mean, that whole politicization was not really resisted explicitly. You can see, and I think so, for example, I think if someone in the 70s even had decided to cancel somebody, and there have been incidents of this in the 60s and 70s, I mean, there's no real resistance because there's not a proper, I mean, there's some resistance from people defending academic freedom, but there weren't really many good arguments. A good example would be, University of British Columbia in 1995 had its political science department was more or less paralyzed with accusations of racism and sexism, not pointing to any individual. It was all non-specific gibberish. They had this high-priced consultant come in. They found, and again, delivered this report about with more non-specific gibberish, and it was a laughingstock in the press. But the point that I'd make is, this is 1995. That's like 20 years ago. Nobody was coming up with a proper argument that says, this is politicization, doesn't belong in the academy. No, they were already way too scared. And so I think this is just something that's got a long lineage. And the only difference now is social media makes the flash mobs easier to organize. Plus, there are more foot soldiers because there have been people coming through the grievance studies programs, through through these highly politicized academies. And so you simply have more foot soldiers. You've got equity and diversity bureaucrats. So there's more people, more activists, more of a supply. But I think they've always been pushing on an open door. I don't think there's ever been a really proper bulwark against these people in the academy.
So does that go back to like Popper's thing of, the enemies of the open society? Like it's, because people use that stupid cartoon of Popper's, paradox of tolerance. Right. And a lot of people who use it, I'm like, you've never read Popper, because that's right. Not what he says. It's like they're mixing repressive tolerance in with Popper's version of tolerance.
Right.
Because again, I'm looking at this and it just, okay, yeah, there's a lot of stupid things out there, but this idea that you can't tolerate an offensive argument. I mean, and I see this coming from people who say they're free speech advocates, who, they're advocates for the Enlightenment and this and that. And they're like, oh, well, you don't want to offend someone. I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't want to go out of my way to, offend someone, but especially on a college campus, you should be able to have a free and open flowing dialogue and not get called out. I mean, I'm seeing in some colleges where they're setting up, oh, if you hear a student say something, call this number or something like that. I mean, it's
right. Biased response teams.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, I worked in the former Yugoslavia. I was in Afghanistan. I was in Haiti. I was in Sudan. These places don't, you had all this kind of stuff there, and the people who are coming from there are terrified. And I mean, like, why would a college want to create that kind of an atmosphere? Like, I mean, if I had kids today, I'd maybe look at trade schools or something, because I mean, honestly, I don't know if I'd want to send my kids to, which is a shame, because I think knowledge is a great thing. I think learning is a great thing, but are you actually doing that there?
You can there is knowledge in much of the university. If you're studying the mating patterns of butterflies or Renaissance pottery, although even Renaissance pottery, you have to watch probably what you're studying, but you have quite a bit of freedom. It's a bit like China. Like, as long as you don't criticize the regime, you can have a nice life, and most people don't even notice the loss of freedom. But if you are in academia, as long as you're not touching any of the sacred cows around race, gender, and sexuality, or anything proximal to that, you can have a very good life and you don't even notice the problem. So the ideological regime, as long as you don't cross it, you've got no problems. Now, the question is, how did the university evolve in this direction? Well, I think that, essentially there was no real resistance post the 1960s. There was this sudden shift in society. Universities had been vocal in opposing McCarthyism, so things that are coming from the right, and rightly so, they were opposing those in the name of academic freedom. But somehow, this has to do with the evolution of liberalism. Liberalism moves from being about equality of opportunity to being about equality of outcome for designated sacred groups. And that happens almost in a fit of absence of mind. Like you see that with the civil rights movement from Martin Luther King, and then switching into President Johnson talking about, affirmative action. It's sort of, even though he didn't use the term affirmative action, he more or less meant it. And what I argue is that what had occurred is liberalism had become identified with minorities and defending minorities. That equation had become so powerful that liberals began to think in terms of, at a very gut level, minority equals good, majority equals bad. And so when you get to a situation where it's still minority equals good, majority equals bad, but instead of equality of opportunity and liberal principles, we're actually going to, we're going to bend those liberal principles, and we're going to restrict the liberalism of the majority in order to help the minority. But hey, we're still within the paradigm of helping minorities against majorities. So this is still liberalism. And that is sort of the sleight of hand that occurs in the mid 60s. And liberals go along with that, and they redefine and kind of torture their concepts in order to justify that. So they'll say, well, by more silencing the powerful, we empower the weak, and that improves their liberty, and so it's liberalism. These sorts of games about bringing equality in the back door and calling it liberalism, and that's sort of what occurs. So now, this then goes into the universities, and they buy into this formula whereby, well, as long as we're helping minorities, that's liberalism. And then once you accept that, it's just about turning the volume up. Minority, instead of minority being good at level 5 and majority being bad at level 5, you crank both those buttons up to 10. And that's what we're living in now, where, majorities are now awful, terrible, racist, supremacist, misogynist, and then you have minorities who are, vulnerable and so vulnerable that, if they hear a phrase like, I don't notice race, then that's a microaggression. Essentially, the hypersensitization, infantilization of minorities, and the hyper demonization of majorities. And that's what we're living through. So I think, essentially what happens is this acquiescence in the sacralization of identity groups as sacred and holy, and therefore cannot be criticized, cannot be offended even. And you get people who emerge as political entrepreneurs who get offended on behalf of. They mind read the so-called mind of the minority, and they get outraged on behalf of. And there's a competitive outrage industry, and then you get social media. So the whole thing is completely spirals out of control, but it has this common ideological root, which goes back to the late 60s. But even there, I think you can trace it back further in a certain way, even to the 1910s. I think you can see in the 1910s the origin of multiculturalism, for example, which is really about saying that, and this is coming from mainly white Protestant intellectuals, Bohemian intellectuals, and these are sort of the ancestors of this cultural left outlook. And they say, well, we WASPs should be cosmopolitan. We should slough off our ethnicity and get away from our ethnicity. We're boring and repressed. And all these immigrant groups, the Jews and Italians and other groups, are really exciting. And we should encourage them to keep their culture and not to assimilate, because then they're going to lose, and they're going to become like us, which is terrible. And so what you get is that dichotomy where ethnicity is really awful for majority white groups and is really great for minorities. And that mindset I think, has remained at the center of this ideology.
Look, my parents immigrated to Canada when I was 6. I appreciate that. I mean, I appreciate that Canada let us in. But when my folks came here, I mean, it wasn't it wasn't like a year-long course or anything. It was a short, I think, 1 week or 2 weeks, where they said, okay, again, I was 6, so I don't remember all of it, but I remember my parents going to this class, and it was just, here are Canadian values. And it wasn't like, we celebrate Thanksgiving. It was just like, you'll tolerate everyone's freedoms. You're allowed to believe what you want. You can't push it on other people, like little things like that. Now that got canceled, budget cuts or whatever. But I mean, I think you need more things like that. But now it's like you said, we have to help the minorities. But I'm looking at what they're doing, and they're equating love of reading with whiteness. They're equating, basically, was it objectivity, love of the written word, professionalism, punctuality. Like, I'm trying to list off some of these things.
Right.
I mean, I'm looking at that. I'm like, you're not helping anyone. Like, if you're telling, black and brown kids that you don't need to study math, or that you need to find a new form of math, you don't need to worry about reading these books. You don't need to worry about, being objective, or what's going on in like K through 12. If a black or brown kid is late, well, don't penalize them, because that's just a cultural thing. I mean, again, someone should at some point stop and say, well, you're not helping anyone. Like, you
Right.
honestly aren't.
Well, first of all, I don't think they're actually that interested necessarily in the black and brown kids. I mean, this is the other, I mean, they're more interested, and I think this is where McWhorter is right. This is largely an identity project, and is mainly a white liberal identity project, where if you took away demonization of whites or males or whatever, then you take away the reason for existence in a way. I mean, they need it to be oppositional. They need the conflict side. It's not simply about helping people who are in some ways not doing well. I mean, that is not particularly exciting. It doesn't give you anything to push against. So I think this is largely a kind of white liberal identity project, which is partly about status, saying that I have a more refined sensibility than the unwashed. So that's part of it. But also, I think a large part of it is a genuine belief. I mean, a genuine belief that this is about this is a moral absolute, that, the majority is evil and the minorities are in need of salvation, or are in need of protection. And my role is I'm going to be one of the good whites. And so I am kind of blessed in the eyes of the Lord. It's almost like that level. And I think that's just unquestioned. That's kind of the belief system that a lot of kind of quote unquote idealistic young people imbibe in our society. It's no longer about class and Marxism. I mean, that's there, of course, but it's mainly about, I'm an anti-racist and everybody else is racist, or I'm an anti-sexist or homophobe or transphobe and everybody else, so I'm more moral than everybody else. I think that is kind of at the core of this belief system. And so anyone who pops up and makes a claim on behalf of one of the sacred, protected, historically disadvantaged groups gets points, if you like. Yes, they're really holy in this value system, in this oppressor-oppressed value system. They clearly are of the more refined sensibility. They're holier than I am. And so it incentivizes more and more people to call people out, to make these claims. And there's no check on this within the elite culture. Now, you have got, of course, the intellectual dark web, and you've got conservatives who are attacking this. But within the elite culture itself and the elite institutions, the official policies that they have, I mean, there's almost no resistance. Yeah. They're completely lost to this. They've completely invested in this entire worldview. And so they'll nod along to academic freedom and the Enlightenment and reason, but whenever there's a clash or a tension, somebody's research suggesting that the group differences is not because of racism, it's because of, I don't know, differences in culture, differences in family structure, whatever. Immediately the racism card will be pulled out. So what you see is that when there's a clash, things like enlightenment and academic freedom, they're thrown under the bus because they have a lower priority compared to the sacred progressive values.
Yeah. No, again, like I said, I was looking at a lot of this stuff, and I was making a lot of comparisons with Islam. Like, I mean, I know, McWhorter's putting out the stuff that, this is like a religion. I know James Lindsay's written a few papers how this is a religion. But I was looking at it from an Islam type of thing. So early 1900s, you had Hassan al-Banna start the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't that popular or that powerful, and a lot of the governments were pushing back against it. But then you have Sayyid Qutb come to the United States, study here, go back to Egypt, and he creates this identity of pan-Arabism. So you have an Arabic identity politics. And, go ahead a couple more, a decade or so after that, or maybe a few years after that, I can't remember the dates exactly. You have Frantz Fanon writing in Algeria, and he writes The Wretched of the Earth, which I found was an awful, awful book, but whatever. You see this stuff coming out, and then you have Edward Said's Orientalism. I mean, so I kind of equated it to, the whatever, quote unquote, the golden age of Islam, and that knowledge gets into Europe, and that leads to two trains of thought. That leads to the tribe of Al-Ghazali, which Aquinas takes up and creates his, rules for burning heretics. And then you have the other people of, like Averroes and Avicenna, and that thought leads to, or partially leads to, the Enlightenment. So here it's this thought going back to the Middle East, and then instead of taking anything good from there, we're taking all the, like, it was a weird mix. And I mean, I see a religious aspect to this. Okay, the anti-racism stuff, everything is looked through the lens of race. I mean, if you take the Robin DiAngelo extreme thing, it's not whether racism occurred, it's how did racism occur.
Right.
It's a foregone conclusion. But if you look at Muslim societies, especially ones that have Sharia, everything is looked on the lens of, is this Islamic, is this halal or haram? Is it okay or is it not? I mean, I guess you can talk about Orthodox Jews as well. Does it follow the halakhic law? Right? It's very, very religious, and like I don't know if it's that. Like I'm not an academic. I'm just some schmuck on Twitter who likes to read. And,
Well, I think there's a commonality in this sense that if you take Islam or Judaism or Protestantism as religions, they are all characterized by itinerant preachers who have followings. And it's not like the Vatican in Catholicism, where there's a centralized hierarchy and whatever. So once you have these roving preachers, they can kind of one up each other by being more fundamentalist and saying these guys are corrupt, they're not following the true ways of Islam or of Judaism, and I have the true, I'm the pure. And that is the same way wokeness operates as a religion, that it's itinerant preachers, except they're on social media or maybe in the media, and they're competing with each other to be the purest of the pure, and so to be the one who calls out and cancels and point the finger at each other, and so you get these purity spirals. Whereas if you imagine if you had like a woke Vatican that could set the doctrine and say, no, this is where we're going and no further, and if you step outside of that, then you're going to be punished or excommunicated or whatever, then it would be a different story. So we have kind of there's a very good environment for fundamentalism because you have this decentered priesthood in wokeness, as you do in Islam, as you do in Judaism. And so that's one commonality, I think. But other than that, I mean, the witch hunting, for example, the witch hunting happens, it happens for a number of reasons, but I think it's easier when you have these competitive preachers that are, trying to get followings and working against each other in some way to bid up the system. The other thing too is you get fundamentalism when everyone is a Muslim and someone comes along and say, I'm the really good Muslim, it's pretty hard to argue against them from the point of view of Islam. And similarly, if everyone's on the left, someone comes around and says, I'm the holiest of the leftists, it's hard to sort of argue against the anti-racists from the left. It's not easy. I mean, some do, but it means, therefore, the more homogenous an environment, the more you're going to get these fundamentalist upsurges. And that's why the university, as it gets more homogenous, it provides more and more fertile soil for these upsurge of what Matthew Iglesias calls the Great Awakening. But you get this upsurge of craziness post-2015. It's actually the third major Great Awakening, which is similar to the Protestant Great Awakenings, by the way, of which there have been 3 or 4 in American history of these revivalist movements. And so with wokeness, we had the first one in the late 60s with the student protests and movements, the second one in the late 80s, early 90s with political correctness, speech codes, Afrocentrism, multicultural, all of that. And then we have had another one since about 2014, 15. Each time, if you look at the mention of words like racist and sexist in English language books, you can see an upsurge each time, each one of these awakenings. But it's not as though they disappear. So you get this upsurge, but then it remains at a higher level. So after the sort of political correctness phase, it's not as though everyone went back to not being politically correct. They more or less locked in those gains, locked in that power. And then now that we've had a third upsurge, they're going to try and lock that power in and move it up to another level and then another level. So this is why, I mean, I think what's interesting is in this awakening now, because they've gone so far, they've actually spawned a lot more. For the first time, we're getting some proper pushback and some proper counter mobilization. More and more institutions are being formed. It's made it onto the political agenda in a way that wasn't true in the 90s in quite the same way. So critical race theory now is a political issue in America, whereas political correctness was never really, it was never really a huge national political issue in the, say, 1990s and 2000s. Yes, you had English only legislation and there was opposition to bilingual education, and you had some of these sort of more bread and butter political campaigns going on at the state level, but you never had this, you didn't quite have the national level political conversation around wokeness and critical race theory and all this. So I'm kind of optimistic in some ways that at least it's now gone so far that it's out in the open and we're having a debate.
About some of the pushback, because I know there's a huge debate on some of these things. Now, again, I've only, when like in the States, I think there's 8 states now that have legislation against critical race theory. But I mean, I think it was only Florida where the governor said we're going after critical race theory. All the other ones said you cannot scapegoat by race and gender and sex. Now, I read the first 4 that had come out, or first 4 or 5. 2 of them kind of worried me about one line, and maybe I'm nitpicking or whatever, but they just said you cannot teach that the United States is a racist place. Now, I preferred the language that the culture minister in the UK used, where it's like you cannot teach this critically, which I think that word critically adds a little bit of nuance that just says you can't teach this, because I'm worried about something like that, like where you can't teach the United States is a racist place, which I mean, I don't agree with that statement, but you might go back to what was going on in the southern states up until about 2 years ago, even, where they were downplaying slavery and downplaying Jim Crow, and students weren't getting a full view of what was actually going on. Like, I mean, I think that's wrong as much as saying the United States is a wholly unredeemable racist place, or that Canada is, or the UK is. Are you concerned about some of these legislations? Like, I think most of them are good, but, you know, there's always the overreach. There's always, you know, creep and things like that.
I agree with you. I think a lot of it isn't well thought out or coming from a solid bedrock of principle. And so, you know, I'm critical of, for example, there's been, you'll have the Trump administration say, well, we're going to have, get rid of critical race theory. We're going to defend academic freedom. But then on the other hand, they're saying universities all have to abide by the, the definition of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is it's not that I have a problem with that definition, but the problem is that it's going beyond the law, and therefore it is essentially a speech code, right? So I would want people who were within the law but can critique that definition to be allowed to do so. That's a consistent approach where you're saying, well, you're allowed speech within the law. And if the university tries to sort of come up with a speech code that is more restrictive than the law, we're not going to let them do it. That's the approach that I would like to see. And as you say, similarly with critical race theory, I would want to allow, you'd want academics to be able to teach critical race theory with a couple of provisos. One is nothing mandatory, so no one should be forced to take it. And so mandatory diversity training that embodies critical race theory, that should be banned. But if people know, if they're going into this with their eyes open, if there's a market for it and someone wants to teach it, I think that's fine. I understand the criticism that they are teaching hatred of a race, but I think universities should be a place where you can really explore ideas, and I would, those ideas then can be critiqued at the university. So I wouldn't want to start specifying banning things necessarily in terms of content, especially where voluntary. Yes, the compulsory stuff should be banned, but not the voluntary. So I think those kind of principles where it stems from a consistent argument and then it's applied. The other thing too is I don't think they've thought well enough about the mechanisms and the enforcement of, they have to get, like in the UK case, they are I think pretty strategic. They're going to set up a position, an office where this individual called the academic freedom champion can more or less breathe down the necks of universities, because you have to put pressure on them, and there has to be teeth in the form of fines. And this is not, it's often portrayed as sort of a violation of academic freedom because the government is telling universities what to do. Well, already the government tells universities all the time they have to abide by academic freedom. And the reason you need the government in there is because the oppression is coming out of, the threat to liberty is coming out of the institutional layer, not the government. So there's three layers as the society: government, these middle layer institutions like universities, or firms or whatever, and then the individual citizen. It's not the case that all oppression of liberty comes from government against citizen. A lot of times it's from these intermediate entities oppressing the citizenry. And that's when you need the government to actually come in and sort of, well, what's the word? I suppose interdict these institutions, prevent them. You have to curb their autonomy in order to safeguard the autonomy of individuals. And this is a situation like that. It's a bit like there's a gang of thugs outside my door. I have no freedom to leave my house until the police arrive and take these people away. And this is a similar situation. Or to take universities, no black students could be admitted to the Southern universities in the early 60s. The federal government had to tell those universities, essentially, you don't have the freedom to determine your own admissions policies. You're going to admit people regardless of race. And so that actually opened up freedom for the citizens who were being denied their freedom. But it was government guaranteeing the freedom. And this is a similar kind of situation. You need the government to come in to restrain the autonomy of the universities in order to allow individuals to have their freedom. But it's not good enough to have a situation like in the US where people have to sue, even though that's important. It's an important safeguard. But if you have to actually fight your university for a year and sue them and maybe possibly lose your job and have to settle out of court or whatever, you're not going to take that risk. And so in order to remove the chill effects, you need a proactive government auditing and enforcement mechanism that is constantly pursuing complaints and constantly auditing universities. That's the way we get rid of at least one part of the equation, which is the hard authoritarianism that comes from threats of discipline. But it has to be, I think, principled. It's got to be coming from a logic that makes sense to everyone. And there are some left-wing students who might want to criticize Israel that can benefit from this as well. I think that is the approach I favor, whereas in the US, you're getting a mix. Some stuff that's really good, but some stuff that I think is misguided, like trying to get rid of tenure, that actually weakens academic freedom. And that's being done in Iowa. A kind of punitive approach, which is all about cutting. You can't cut your way out of this problem. I just think trying to apply that kind of economic dollars and cents approach to this. This is a cultural issue and needs cultural principles behind it.
Okay, I mean, like I've been equating a lot of this stuff to, like I was just saying, it's one overcorrection after another. Like you get an overcorrection from the right, you get an overcorrection from the left. It's the pendulum's not stopping in the middle anywhere to let like a sensible solution come through. But I agree with you. Like if they want to teach critical race theory in universities and someone wants to pay for that course, no problem. But it's the application afterwards. Like I don't think, in the same way I wouldn't want curriculums for K through 12 formed by Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Scientology or any of that other stuff. I wouldn't want curriculums formed by, critical race theory or the anti-racism that's an offshoot of it, or even gender studies and things like that. Like these, they're not proven. They're unfalsifiable. I mean,
Right.
the anti-racism that comes from critical race theory is completely unfalsifiable. Denying racism is, like it's so. And I don't think you should teach kids to look at race. I mean, there was a video that came out, it was an audio basically, but it came out yesterday, and it was a kid in the high school, and a teacher says, "When you look at this picture, what do you see?" And this kid raises up his hand, and just says, or I'm assuming he raises up his hand because you just hear it. He says, "I just see two people chilling," and the teacher's forcing the kid to focus on the race of the two people in that picture, and the kid's like, "Why do you want me to do that? Like, why do you want me to look at the race of these two people?" And that's where I have a problem. Like, I think that should be banned. Like not that teacher should be fired, or maybe he should, but that you get, like I wouldn't want a curriculum based on Islam. I wouldn't want a curriculum, based on Christianity. It's the same thing here, but universities should have that freedom. Like I disagree with some of the hardcore, like I like James Lindsay, but I disagree with his stance that get rid of everything. It's the same reason I wouldn't agree with fire a biology teacher who's a young earth creationist. If that biology teacher can teach the course material and the kids are doing a good job, they're getting good grades or meeting let the guy believe in his nonsense as long as he can teach it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I also think that, I mean, I understand the point that obviously you don't necessarily want somebody in there teaching, protocols of the elders of Zion or whatever. But there are some checks on this. I mean, one is such a person would have to get hired in the first place, which would presume they have to have a publication record and something not completely insane. Also, their student ratings. If the person's ratings are terrible and no one's taking his course, that would lead to questions being asked that could effectively lead to the same thing without having to actually police content content that is within the law. I mean, I think the problem is we need to have total academic freedom within the law. That's the only secure principle, I think, for universities. Now, what I think you can do is to say, well, if you have a course in the English department and it's got critical race theory and it's mandatory to getting an English degree, I mean, I think you can require universities to put up like cigarette warning labels just saying, this course contains critical race theory. This is necessary to get the degree. So as long as people are properly informed and they know, yes, I'm taking English to an English degree, it requires critical race theory to get the degree, I'm informed about that, then okay, I think that, so I think you can actually ask them to do that. I think that's not a violation of academic freedom, but I think banning it is. So that's sort of the distinction I would make. So I understand the concern that this is kind of hatred against a group, which I think I would agree with. But at the same time, I think these are tricky questions because they'll always say, no, we're just criticizing this system, not white people. Of course, then they toggle back very quickly to white people. But leaving that aside, I think there is obviously a gray zone. There are a lot of, you could say Marxism is very much anti the middle class or anti-capitalist or whatever, and that creates a certain kind of hatred. So it's a very sort of difficult game to police all of these theories. I think it's better to allow these theories to battle it out. But at the same time, I think it's reasonable for societies to say, well, put a health warning if you're going to, just so people know what they're getting into. And they can choose it. If they really want to do it, they can do it. That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, same thing. I mean, and as far as like the protocols of the elders of Zion and stuff like that, again, you could teach a course on conspiracy theories and include that in it. Because you're teaching conspiracy theories. I mean, I took a couple of courses at university on terrorism, and we were learning about terrorist organizations and how they worked, and how, some person said, "Oh, well, you're creating terrorists." I'm like, "Well, no, the guy was, so." I mean, I understand that. Like, there's a way to teach the protocols of elders of Zion. Like, it shouldn't be taught as fact. It should just be taught as this is what happened.
But I suppose the issue is if someone's teaching critical race theory as a kind of like fact, which is kind of what occurs.
Yeah.
That's really the question, right? Is whether you'd allow that. And I guess my view is, well, there's going to be radicalism that is going to be taught. Now, you're right, though. There's a very clear double standard that, in theory, if someone's allowed to teach critical race theory, they should be allowed to teach, some kind of Jewish conspiracy or whatever. I think that there is a clear double standard that progressive conspiracy theories are okay because they seem to be quote unquote radical, which isn't the same as a conspiracy. Well, in fact, it is the same, but it's a different label. And there's a toleration for that kind of radicalism in a way there wouldn't be for right-wing radicalism. And so that is not, in my view, justifiable. I mean, they would say, well, one's harmful and the other isn't. Well, actually, I think if you were to look at the downstream effects of, Marxism, for example, and then if you were to look at the downstream effects of left modernism as identity-based leftism, I think you would also find a lot of negativity there. I'm not sure that's the right justification. I think probably, ideally, you wouldn't have any of this stuff, or you'd only have a fringe of this stuff being taught. But I just think it's the wrong approach to go in and start policing content in a very intrusive way. I think you can police it if it's mandatory, but not if it's voluntary. I think so. That's where I part company a bit with James.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I like James a lot. I get along with him, but yeah, I disagree with him on that. It was the same, but it's like you mentioned the lawsuits, because I know there's a woman in Nevada the court approved it. I think she said she's going in for a deposition today. I think she tweeted that out last night. Now, I hope she wins, but at the same time, I don't want to see lawsuit after lawsuit taking down school districts, taking down schools. I mean, you don't want to bankrupt the school system. You really don't.
Yeah, but I agree with you. But at the same, sorry, go ahead.
No, it was just that, like, I'm hoping like this one case in Nevada goes far enough that I was just saying, I hope it goes far enough that it goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court rules.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think these schools, if they care about their funding, they should stop teaching this stuff. I think that there's also an important difference between universities and schools. Universities, it's adults who are voluntarily selecting in, have a lot of choice. Schools it's a state interest. You have to go. It's very different. And I think that it's reasonable. For example, it's reasonable to say, as we have in Britain, that schools must not indoctrinate. They must be politically neutral. They cannot sort of present something as truth that is nakedly political. I think that's very reasonable in the school context, and that implies a certain restriction on the individual teacher's freedom to espouse political positions. Whereas I think in the university case, where people are adults, they can choose what they want to study. If some lecturer or professor wants to be political, they can be political in a way I don't think should be allowed in the school. So I don't think it's the same exact situation. Yes, we want to allow as much freedom for the teachers as we can, but equally, I think the political neutrality consideration looms larger in the school setting. And equally, something like the teaching of history, the state has an interest in producing citizens that are going to be taxpayers, that are, they have an interest in a kind of history that is going to be, while not concealing the warts of the past, that is still going to foreground the good stuff more than the bad stuff, let's say. And I think that's reasonable in a school, whereas in a university, perhaps in a university, there's more room for, critical perspectives, or perspectives that are not about building that national loyalty as much. So I think that there's slightly different rules that obtain in a university where academic freedom has to be paramount, whereas in some of the other public institutions, it is one value amongst others, and it can take a back seat in some cases to other state state imperatives, let's say. So in a case of the heritage in museum industry in Britain, for example, yes, you can talk about colonialism, but that again, it's reasonable to say that shouldn't be the dominant. The criticism shouldn't be the dominant strand of what the National Trust or various museums are doing if they're funded by the government. I think that's reasonable. Government has an interest, whereas in universities, I think that criticism and critiquing received wisdom has to be the sort of highest principle, and so you can't, whenever there's a clash between academic freedom and other values, those other values should be secondary.
I was looking at some of the stuff in the United States, and there's only 2 states that have mandatory civics lessons that you need to graduate with. Now, when I went to high school, we learned about civics, and we learned about our rights and our responsibilities. All I hear people talking about is rights, rights, rights. I don't hear people talking about their responsibilities as a citizen. Again, that comes down to K through 12 education. The teaching kids rights and responsibilities of the citizens. Like, every citizen has rights, but they also have responsibilities. The social contract type of thing, right? Like, you have a responsibility not to kill someone. You have a responsibility not to steal. You have I don't think that's being emphasized enough.
No, I agree. I mean, there's so many things that aren't being taught, including respect for free speech, for example. And so, a lot of students are just coming out with this view that emotional safety is the highest good, and they are simply being socialized by the media, particularly by celebrity culture and pop culture, into this left modernist identity-centered belief system and this sort of religion. So I think you're right. I think there isn't that, and it ideally would be there.
Look, I know you got to get going a little bit, so I don't want to keep you too long. I've got to get a couple of things done myself. So if you got any last words about some of the stuff that's going on, or maybe some words of hope, please go ahead and let people know where they can get a hold of you.
Well, you can find my website is www.sneps.net. And then I'm on Twitter at EPKAUFM, EP Kaufman. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. I mean, just looking ahead, I think, it's interesting. To some degree, I mean, this is a strange way of looking at it, but to some degree, the excesses of wokeness have pushed into view for a larger number of people the underlying problems with the worldview that came of age in the late 1960s, which is more or less the anti-majority, pro-minority worldview. It's a very kind of emotional it's an emotional substructure that drives a whole set of ideas. And I think we need to, ultimately as a society, we need to sort of come to a realization that everybody is the same, rather than that there are some groups of people that are special and holy and others that are fallen and damned. And, I think it's happening. I mean, I think there is more pushback now than there was during the era of political correctness in the sort of early 90s. And that gives me some hope that there is a mobilization. But I also think we can't just sacrifice an entire generation. I mean, the problem's going to get worse before it gets better, because the younger generation is more saturated in this religion. They don't really... for them, free speech is not an automatic thing the way it was for, say, our generation. And so we're going to need more government. We're going to need democratically elected governments and the courts to step in more intrusively into institutions to be sure that they are upholding freedom of speech, academic freedom, and so on. And that's, I think, going to kind of define some of the politics of this going forward, is that the conservative and or centrist forces are going to need to embrace even though it goes against some of their core beliefs, they think they're going to really need to embrace government intervention into these institutions in a quite intrusive way, in a way that is really all about upholding the law and is all about protecting liberty of individuals from predatory institutions. The reason those institutions are predatory is because activists are able to infiltrate and put pressure on those institutions. And really the only way to shut down the power of those activists is to use government sanctions, carrots and sticks, which are so obvious and so clear that universities and other institutions can say to the activists, look, even if we sympathize with you, our hands are completely tied. We can't do anything. And only at that point is liberty going to be safe, and can we move on? So I guess it's a plea for people to sort of stop thinking that you can cut your way out of this problem, or that somehow libertarianism and the market is going to save us. It won't. It's going to take patient government intervention, really, in order to actually neutralize the problem within the institutions. And then it's also, of course, going to take the wider cultural battle to stick up for values of liberty as against emotional safety.
That's a good way to end on. Well, Eric, thank you very much for coming on.
Great. Thanks, Obaid. It was great. And good luck. Good luck. And keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job.
I'll keep plugging along. And thanks, everyone, for listening.